And we're all coming through clear?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to check on the panel.
Do you guys hear that?
Yeah. What is that?
My neighbor's lawnmower going right now. Okay, so we are going live now, so it's coming through on my YouTube channel now. So we are all set to go.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Hello and welcome to the Social Distance Book Fest, where you can stay home while supporting authors and indie bookstores and hopefully add a few new books to your TBR. I'm Rachel, and my YouTube channel is Rachel Ray. And on my channel, I share my love for books from a variety of genres, but there's a bit more focus on adult lit and nonfiction there. So today I'm excited to be hosting an amazing group of authors for our panel, Identity Formation and Deconstruction in Adult Fiction. In a moment, I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, but if you're wondering what the Social Distant Book Fest is, here's a brief overview. So this is an all-day event created by a dedicated group of bookworms from all corners of the internet, and it includes 18 panels, more than 80 authors, virtual fandom meetups, virtual signing opportunities, and some amazing giveaways. Check out our website and social media, link below for all the details, and check out our bookshop.org page where you can order books from featured authors and support indie bookstores. 10% of the proceeds will be donated to the Center for Disease Philanthropy's COVID-19 fund, and we hope you take advantage of everything the Book Fest has to offer. And in case you miss any interesting panels, check out our playlist of all the panels and meetups, which will continue to be available for viewing. So there was a bit of a glitch for my upload, so all of these links will be revised and edited in my description box below after this is over. So with that being said, let's hear from our panelists. Please introduce yourselves, including your preferred pronouns, and tell us about your book.
Great. I'll go first. I'm Christina Clancy, and my pronouns are she, her. And this is my book. It's called The Second Home. And it's due out June 2nd from St. Martin's Press. It's a story of some siblings from Milwaukee who are from a kind of middle-class family, and they have inherited a home in Cape Cod that was a home that's been in the family for generations. And as often happens, they can't afford to keep it. They don't know what to do with the house, even though it's very nostalgic for them. And so in figuring out what to do with the house, they also have to reconcile with some secrets that came up in their past when they were teenagers. So it's good for family drama. People are feeling nostalgic and who really want to go somewhere and can't right now, which is all of us.
Relatable.
I'm Alexandra Chang, the author of Days of Distraction, which came out March 31st, just last month. And it is a coming of adulthood story told from the perspective of a young Chinese American woman who at the opening is working as a technology journalist. And then it follows about a year and a half in her life as she goes through these life transitions, like moving across the country to upstate New York with her boyfriend. And in that process is trying to figure out and find a sense of self.
I'm Zeyn Joukhadar. My pronouns are he and him. I'm the author of 2 books. I'm in kind of an interesting situation because my second book, The 30 Names of Night, was supposed to come out in May, but it's been moved back to November. That book is about the Syrian American community in New York. It's specifically about a trans guy who discovers that he has some links to a mysterious bird painter from the 40s and uncovers the history of queer and trans people in his community. But I'm mostly, since my book doesn't come out till November now, I'm mostly going to be talking about my debut, which is The Map of Salt and Stars. And The Map of Salt and Stars is about it's 2 intertwined stories that basically centers on a family of Syrian refugees who are traveling through the Levant and across North Africa to safety, while the youngest daughter in the family is telling herself as a comfort the story of a group of fabled map makers that made the same geographical journey just 800 years before.
I am Asako, and here is my book, Inheritors. It's going to be out in July. It's a collection of interconnected stories that revolve around the Second World War, the Pacific side, and it traces 5 generations of a family scattered across Asia and the U.S. By that war, and it's my attempt to put it into its larger context and explore sort of its relevance today.
And my name is Steve Wright. I'm the author of The Coyotes of Carthage, which has a giant glare on it, I see. My book follows the experience of Andre Ross. Andre is a former juvenile offender and con man who is now a political consultant. And when we meet him, he's given the opportunity to run a grassroots dark money campaign in South Carolina. Basically, his job is to buy an election on behalf of a mining corporation. The book was influenced by my experience. I'm currently in Madison, Wisconsin, where I'm the director of the Wisconsin Innocence Project. And for 5 years, I served in the United States Department of Justice, the Obama administration's voting section, doing voting and election law.
Awesome. So we'll get into our questions. And the first question that I have is that in each of your books, you explore the way we form or deconstruct our identities. How and why did you explore these themes within your work? We can just work across the screen. And Christina, I think you're up first.
Okay. I think with my book, I was thinking about the identity issue for this panel. And I think it has to do a lot with our identities as they're formed through our families. Because sometimes I think one of my characters in particular kind of comes loose from the family and is lost, not, spiritually lost, because she doesn't have that grounding sense of being with the family. And I think that was inspired by my own family. When my grandparents died, my mom was driving around. My grandparents died very close, within 5 days of each other. It was really shocking, and no one was quite ready for it. And I remember we were driving around together, my mom and I, and my mom said that with her sisters, they were trying to figure out what to do with the house that they had. And my mom said, when your parents die, it's up to siblings to figure out whether or not they want to hold a family together. Like if you should even continue to be a family anymore. And I remember thinking, I was in my 20s at the time, how strange that thought was, that you had to choose whether or not to be part of a family. And I think when we choose to leave a family or to bring a family back together again, it has a lot to do with our identity, like reconciling your past identity, your identity with your family. And so I think that's probably how my own life inspired the novel.
Yeah, for me, I think I was interested in exploring this woman who is going through like a major transition in her life, and in that process is still trying to figure out her identity. And the narrator of my book is in her early mid-20s, which is a time period where, every decision feels like very weighted. So she feels like her job is like a big part of who she is, her family, her relationship, where she's living. And then all of that is sort of put under pressure in the book. And that was something that I think I was interested in, probably because I had lived through something similar. And in particular, exploring how a young Chinese American woman is trying to form a sense of self in a predominantly white society here. So here being America. So I was interested in trying to figure out how to dramatize that formally and figure out a way, I guess, like in the novel, to show how this woman like tries to grasp at a sense of identity, but still fails in a lot of ways, and sort of shifts into these moments of doubt and moves back and forth between like being able to figure it out and remaining lost.
I think in both of my books, I'm really interested in how we map our identities with respect to the people around us, and also the places that we come from. And in my debut in the Map of Salt and Stars, that was more literal because it was about a family who were displaced, and so especially the main character was trying to figure out, well, how do I form my relationship with a place that I can't go back to, and in relationship to people that I'm separated from, as well as people that who had passed away before they had been displaced. And so there's we also grapple, I think, with these questions even just in terms of grief and losing people, regardless of some of these, like the big things that I dealt with in the book in terms of being somebody who was going through war, who was experiencing displacement. There are also those like little ways that we have to figure out, well, who am I with this person or without this person? Or who am I in relationship to where I come from if now I find myself in another place, or if I'm growing up in diaspora? And I mean, those are questions that I've grappled with throughout my work, and I think I'll continue to.
Yeah, I think definitely displacement is a big theme in my book too, and in my life. I'm Japanese. My parents are Japanese. My family's Japanese, but I grew up in Southeast Asia, and I went to these British international schools. So my whole education has been in English, and this is why I speak English. And I knew much more about England and Europe than Asia and Japan. And because there was a Japanese school in the countries that I lived in, I basically had no Japanese community, or I didn't know any kids who were Japanese or anything like that growing up. And so my language-wise and also culturally, Japanese was confined to my own home and my own family, and the rest of my life sort of was conducted in English. And that was sort of a hodgepodge, cultural situation, because everybody was from a different country. So we didn't have a stable sort of culture, except for this international school culture. And then in middle of high school, I went back to Japan and I went to an American school, and that was a whole different system. And all of a sudden I was surrounded by, Japanese and American people. And I kind of lived basically like an expat in my own country. So, my passport is, I'm Japanese by passport, I guess. But, I can't really say that I'm from there in any kind of way, any kind of conventional way. And I'm not Southeast Asian. And, I've been here a long time, but I'm not really American either. And I'm kind of reminded of this all the time, So displacement is this big theme, and some of my stories definitely deal with this. But I think in general, the whole book has to do with this, because after the war, Japan went through a huge identity crisis. Its national and imperial identity broke down, and everybody had to kind of reform, their sense of identity.
For me, my novel was sort of born. I was like a lot of people, I think, at the end of my MFA experience, and I had short stories, but I was really reaching that point where I wanted to write a novel, and I didn't completely know what I wanted to write a novel about. And so my friends and mentors were like, "Why don't you just write a novel about some things that you know about?" And so most of my life as a civil rights lawyer and a criminal defense lawyer has really been about, in particular, people of color and how they navigate institutions, whether there are political institutions like elections and voting and campaign finance, or our criminal justice system, whether they are defendants or whether they are prosecutors and lawyers. And so the novel really was an attempt to sort of to synthesize a lot of what I had learned, flavored by the fact that I'm sort of a cynic and smartass. And so, the book at its core is about a black man from Washington D.C., a poor community in Washington D.C. He has a criminal record, and then he's thrown into a very conservative community in South Carolina. It's a 100% poor, 100% white, 100% conservative, and how he sort of navigates pulling off a con or an election there.
Love it. So each of your stories cover a significant transition, choice, or change in one or multiple main characters. How much of these characters are inspired by your own life? So we talked, I think about 3 out of 5 have already kind of answered that a little bit. But if you all could just touch a little bit on the inspiration from your own life and how that poured into your stories.
I think for my characters, there's 3 narrators of my book, and they each have a different perspective on their family. And I think all of them represent some sort of experience that I could kind of relate to. One of the characters, Anne, she's kind of confident, maybe overly so. She's very focused on being popular and accepted, and she pays a very large price for that. She's sexually assaulted, and that didn't happen to me, but I think as a woman you are always so aware, as anyone really, I shouldn't say as a woman, we're all aware of how our sexuality is seen and viewed and can be trespassed and violated, and how that can become a very private thing, where you don't really want other people to know about it. And so I think some people question the decisions that Anne makes in the book, but I think she's guarding herself, she's trying to survive. And then my character Poppy, I think, kind of represents the wanderlust that I have. This idea that, I'm on the one hand, it's weird to talk about wanderlust during this quarantine, because on the one hand, I do like being at home and I like the comfort of that, but I also am always feeling like I ought to be somewhere else, and that maybe there's some better version of myself somewhere else. So I think I can relate to Poppy's character. And then there's a character named Michael who's he was adopted by the family. And he was inspired actually by a kid that I used to mentor at a Central City school in Milwaukee. And I met this little boy, Michael, and I would read with him. And he had a lot of emotional issues, but I think it was just, he didn't get a lot of attention. And then he just disappeared one day. And I never knew what happened to him. And I kind of wanted to find some sort of I knew that life would be hard for him, but I wanted him to find some sort of place with other people where he could feel comfortable. And it's not just in the home, but it's also in a geography. I think that for myself, one of my friends said that we all have our own biosphere, like there's a place that we feel really comfortable. Maybe it's the desert, maybe it's by the mountains or by an ocean. We don't know why. But I think for Michael, he never would have otherwise seen a different geography to see if that's where he could find his identity and feel comfortable in a different geographic place. So I think I've always wondered that about myself as well.
For me, the book draws a lot from my own life. It's I do think of it as like a fictionalization of lived experience. Like the narrator, I worked as a technology journalist in San Francisco. I left that job to move across the country with my boyfriend, who is white. And the book explores a lot about like the dynamics of being in an interracial relationship, at least the particularities of being in a relationship between an Asian American woman and a white man. And that transition of leaving behind a career as a journalist and moving to a very small upstate New York town, sacrificing, that sense of self for a relationship and building a new identity, I guess, in a new place. That's a transition that I went through in my early 20s. And in writing the book, I was already maybe 4 or 5 years out from that experience. So that was like the kind of distance I think I needed to be able to write from those emotional experiences and be able to fictionalize them as well.
I think that I drew more on some of my own experiences for my second book than for my debut. Because with the Map of Salt and Stars, I am not myself a refugee, but I am Syrian American. And actually, I really took pains to be deliberate about who my protagonist in that book was. I deliberately made the character Syrian American and someone who was coming to Syria for the first time with their family, because this youngest daughter was born in the U.S., but the rest of her family was born in Syria, and so she hasn't experienced that. And so she's, from New York, and I'm from New York as well, and she's coming to the Levant for the first time, and is, having trouble with the language, and is, saying, I'm like of this place, but also not of this place, and what does that mean? And like in that way, those experiences I could relate to, and I tried to be aware all the time that there were certain perspectives I could authentically write from, and then there were other ones that were just like not my story to tell. Like I don't think that it would have been right for me to tell a story of someone who was born and raised in Syria and then became a refugee. It's too far removed for me to be able to be confident in my ability to tell that story well, and I think it's for other people, right? With my second book, I did draw more on, my experience being Syrian American, of being queer, and of being trans, and being Muslim, and like what it's like to, inhabit all of those identities in one body at the same time, especially considering that, I sometimes get questions about like, well, but, how can you be this and this, and how these things can't coexist? And it's like, well, they coexist in my body, and I wanted them to also coexist on the page. And I think, as I try to progress in my own work as a writer, but also as a human being, I think I try to like make those things breathe on the page. The more that I go along, the more joy I take in that.
Yeah, I think
too, who can see themselves in your story, I'm sure they'll be able to as well, and be grateful for that.
I hope so.
I definitely feel like my life has sort of been in transit, whether it's from culture to culture, or country to country, or language to language. But I think, it's more when I think about my parents and my grandparents' life that I think about transitions and individual choices. My grandparents lived through the war. My father was born during the war, and my mother was born afterwards, like during the American occupation. And so they went through this really big cataclysm, like most of their generation. And, by the time my mother was born, Japan was just in shambles. There's millions and millions of homeless and starving people. Society had broken down. The country was occupied by a foreign power, all of this stuff. And people really had to figure out a way to survive and rebuild their lives in radical ways. And there was a real need also for change, because obviously something wasn't working, and everybody was sort of reflecting on their choices, not just their immediate and future choices, but also their past choices, sort of what role they played in bringing about this cataclysm, whether it's at an individual or collective level. And also, how they contributed also to sort of bringing about this violence to other people too, and so this is kind of a big theme in my book, and this theme of individual and collective responsibility, and also the location of agency, in the sense of where our power as individuals reside, and if we even have power in relation to larger political and social forces. So that's kind of a big question that I'm invested in.
For me, a lot of the book, in particular, a lot of the scenes are fictionalized expressions of moments I'd actually lived. And sometimes they're for humorous effect, and sometimes they're not. When we were editing it, I think my editor in particular was interested in a lot of what he saw as sort of the microaggressions that sometimes happen when you have two very distinct cultures that don't know very much of each other and often are very mistrustful each other, and how you can sort of portray those on the page. In some ways, the book goes. I I tried very hard to not wag my finger or to judge, but to point out that these awkward moments do happen, these uncomfortable moments happen, these indignities do happen, and how they end up shaping both the characters or in real life a person's life.
Absolutely. So the next question that we had, and again, this one is kind of tying in all of these three about how much of your own identity has made it into the story. We've kind of alluded to this already, but if anyone wants to share any extra pieces that you haven't covered already.
You know, I just find it interesting. So often readers assume that the writer is part of the story. And it's, you know, I used to have a professor who would say, which part of fiction do you not understand? And it is nice to be able to take something, like everyone here on the panel, it sounds like they're saying these things happen to us on some level. We can in some way relate to the situations that our characters are in or their struggles that they have, but they're not us. And I think that fictional space is so freeing to be able to put in play ideas in a world that's not our own. And I like the idea of people reading it, not thinking it's about me. You know, it's like kind of that post-constructionist view of reading where you know, the author is not necessarily, you can almost see the text separate from the author, which seems very different than the way we see the author in the text now because of Twitter and social media and things that we're doing right now, for example. But it is definitely fun as a writer to create a different space, a fictional place.
Well said.
Okay. So how did you develop, or what went into the development of the title for your book? What's the connection from the main story to what you decided, finally, this shall be called it?
I don't know if you want to go around again. Talk a lot. But my title originally was long. I went through this phase where I wanted a long title for my book that sounded like a sentence. And it was, for a while, it was No Place Better Than This. And my agent called me up before we submitted it. And she said, you know, I always forget the name of your title. So I think we need a new one. And I don't know why. It took me forever. I didn't want it to be called The Second Home because I figured that title had already been taken. And it hadn't. So I just think it's the perfect title for the book because it is about the tensions that arise from a second space, a second home.
For me, I had a title that was sort of a placeholder for a while. It was Distances. And it wasn't a title that I was necessarily like unhappy with, but once it got into the revision stages, my editor was like, yeah, this title isn't doing enough. It's not like indicative enough of what the book is about. And at one point while we were throwing around ideas, she mentioned having a title that maybe alluded to the time period of this woman's life, you know, the age or what she's going through. So I had a very long, I don't know, I'm very bad at titling. So I had a super long document where I just like had a bunch of words that I thought maybe would work. And then like variations of like these combinations of these words. So I think I was like, I must have had like at least 10 titles with the word distraction in it. And then a bunch with like words like minor and like quarter. I kept on thinking of the like quarter life crisis. But anyway, after going through that, landed on Days of Distraction, which I felt like did capture not only like the time period that the narrator is living through, but also her mindset and like her emotional state as well, and did not predict how relevant it would be to this moment in time also.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is like bringing back so many memories. My title also got changed when it was in production, and I'm definitely for the better because I also I don't know. I don't think I'm very good at titling either because I always end up either changing my mind or it'll be really long or whatever. But I did the same thing where I ended up like, my editor was like, you know, I think maybe we should change it. And my original title was like long and it's a little bit abstract. And I think that one thing that I really like about the new title, and actually this ended up being the case with both books, like I started with a really abstract title And I ended with a really concrete title that was very visual. And I do that thing too, where I make like a list of, phrases or words, and it's like 50 items long, and I recombine them, and eventually I picked the map of salt and stars because it worked well with the symbolic parts of the book. So in terms of like salt as a symbol, and then stars as a symbol, salt being a symbol of actually, it comes from there's a character in the book who's a geologist, and he has this conversation with the narrator about how salt occurs in precious stones as something that jewelers think of as an imperfection that changes the color of the stone. But that actually it doesn't, there's nothing that like says that it has to be that way. It doesn't necessarily, do anything other than that to the stone. It's just a different color. And that certain things in our lives, especially traumatic things, are these sort of unavoidable parts of life that happen to us that we don't have any control over, and that we tend, at least definitely in the West and in Arab culture as well, and I think in a lot of cultures, we pathologize trauma so much, and we stigmatize people that survive trauma. And I wanted to write about a character that undergoes traumatic events in their life, but comes out saying, this doesn't define me. I get to define myself on something other than this, and that there's life after that. It's not just something that occurs and it's shocking, and then we don't hear how they react to it. I think the important thing is like how the person reacts to it, and that there is so much more to life than just those things that especially get talked about when we're talking about like refugees and people that survive war. That's like a tiny facet of who people are, So I think that the title change was good ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, I think titles are just really hard. It's really hard to capture something in a few words, really, And so, yeah, I mean, my title went through a lot. I went through a lot of title changes too. And my editor and I were talking about maybe other alternatives too, And then the book cover design person designed this awesome book cover. And this image, of the paper cutout, this chain of paper cutout figure, somehow having okay, with the images of the war sort of, burned into them, sort of anchored this title here, and sort of brought out this idea of the generations that have inherited this history. And so I got to keep my title.
I too am a member of the I don't know what makes a good title club. My novel deals in large part with elections and politics, and it begins with a series of back and forths from a case called Citizens United, where the U.S. Supreme Court allowed corporations to participate in elections. And the majority in that opinion ultimately comes very close to what people now know as the phrase of corporations are people. But there's a dissent, and the dissent sort of is mocking the majority. The Supreme Court said that this idea that corporations or people are long held and strongly and a part of the country from the beginning, but the dissent sort of called bullshit on that, and in doing so they mocked the majority and said, the majority pretends to be the guardian of ancient values. So I really liked that phrase, and I thought it was a great title. No one in my life agreed. To make it worse, that came out around the same time that Guardians of the Galaxy came out. So everyone thought for certain there would just be mass confusion about what my book was. And so then I moved on to a second title, and I can't even remember what it was, but people hated it equally as much. And so by the time we were going to sell the book, my agent was finally like, Steve, just pick a title. And I said, I don't know. What is it? He says, where's it set? Carthage. And I said, okay, do we want alliteration? He says, how about Coyote? And that's how we got the Coyotes of Carthage. Like, I wish I could say it was a thoughtful, artistic endeavor, but really it was just oh God, I want to get this over with endeavor.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Love them. They're all so unique. You almost want to just create a book title generator and just put keywords from your story into it, and whatever comes out, just go with that. Did any of you have general ideas of how your stories would flow, or did characters surprise you throughout the writing process? was it all put together in the grand scheme and then you had to just work on the details, or did the details come as one place was filled in, so did the next?
You know, with my book, I wanted to do something more experimental. I wanted to go back and forth with time. And then it just seemed as if the story needed to be told in a more chronological way for it to make sense. And I'm a pantser. I don't outline. I just write. And I just listened to Emily St. John Mandel, an interview with her. And she made me feel so much better. She said, you know, if you're a pantser, you know, and you don't outline and you just write and see what's going to happen. Because I like being surprised by what happens because it allows more mystery for yourself as a writer. But she said, just know your first draft is going to be a total mess. And I was like, oh, that's so true. My first draft was a mess, you know, and it maybe makes it a little harder to go back. You know, you have more work to do to clean it up. But that's just how I write. Like was it Evelyn Wells? Someone said, if I knew how my story would end, why would I write it? You know, so that's me. But I admire people who have outlines. I wish I could write like that.
Yeah, I don't write with outlines either. This book is structured as a series of fragments that range from like a sentence to maybe, I think the longest one is maybe like 2.5 pages. So when I was starting the book, I was just adding these like sections into a long document without thinking about structure or order. I like needed to lower the stakes for myself in order to even think of the book as a novel. So I was just like, words on the page, here they are. Like, I'll worry about everything else later. And then once I did have a certain number of words and pages, that's when I started to think about like actually organizing the book and giving it a sense of an arc. And yeah, like Christina said, it was a lot more work later because I hadn't planned anything at all. But I ended up having to cut like a third of it in that process and fill in the gaps. So I don't think necessarily that anything was like super surprising for me in terms of like the character because the character draws so much from my own experiences, but the surprises came in structure and form and in figuring out the way that I wanted the story to move from beginning to end.
I'm a little different. I am a plotter, and I tend to make extensive use of like spreadsheets and I also have a background in science, so maybe it's
very satisfying about a good spreadsheet.
So the thing though is that like for me, I can't really start writing until I have a pretty clear idea of the major problem and how it's going to play out and how it's going to end. And so I actually the seed of the story, especially in my debut in The Map of Salt and Stars, the seed already kind of implied like the beginning and the middle and the end, especially because I wanted to tell a story about stories. So the basic premise was that if somebody is undergoing the trauma of displacement, especially as a child, like what are the stories that we tell ourselves about where we come from and who we are that help us to get through experiences like that? And you know how a story, like telling a story in your own words, in the book serves as a sort of metaphor for like, okay, well, other people are going to tell your story for you, and they're going to try to impose a narrative upon you, but you don't have to follow that narrative. You can also trust your own voice, and your narrative about what you've been through matters more than what other people are going to say about you. So because I had those sort of dual stories that were going to have to take place intertwined with each other, I kind of knew as I was going along, okay, this structure is implied here and followed that. But still, my characters still managed to surprise me, right? Like I can think I know everything, and every time I sit down to write, I find myself like, oh, I didn't see that coming somehow, but okay, let's roll with it.
Yeah, I mean, I also don't really plot, but I was working with a specific conceptual canvas and this sort of vast historical time. And the stories are connected genealogically and also thematically. So the earlier stories, I definitely had room for discovery and exploration, and there were lots of surprises, But the later stories, they felt so hemmed in by all of these other stories around them. And then, ultimately, I was writing about people and a culture and historical events that were really kind of controversial or sensitive or traumatic, And so I felt really responsible for my material and, and the way I was representing everything. And so it felt kind of like tightroping sort of, across like all these minefields, but ultimately, you're writing about people in the muck of life, and so there's a lot of things that come up and like links between stories, and things like that you never thought of that could open up a whole new thematic layer or something like that. And then there are other surprises, like you realize that something that you're really quite attached to isn't working or won't work, and so there's that kind of surprise too.
For me, I think I was somewhere in the middle. Um, I was very fortunate in that the novel is based around a political campaign, and I knew going into it, I knew in chapter 1 that the book's entire the lifespan of the time that the book would cover would be 13 weeks. And because I tried to make it as realistic as possible, I actually looked up what are the laws about how you run a campaign in South Carolina. And there are built-in dates at each place. In 90 days, you have to do this, 90 days, you have to do that. And so I was fortunate to have like plot points very much stuck in the actual narrative. But how do you go about filling that space, and how I went about introducing characters and those type of things, I didn't outline before. I will say that I too am a big fan of spreadsheets for what it's worth. So just saying this, this is this chapter, this is how many words it is, this is when this character appears, this is where it's set, this is what it adds. Like the worst part is when I finished the novel. The original novel was like 160,000 words, which is just ungodly. But it would literally take my computer 2 minutes to open the spreadsheet. Like, I would open the spreadsheet, go to the refrigerator, fix a snack, and come back just in time for the spreadsheet. And so, the part of the worst parts of editing, the book ended up being about half that but you literally see the spreadsheet just shrinking. I don't write like one master file. I have one for each chapter, and I'm very sort of anal about those things. But yeah, so I'm a big believer in the spreadsheet, but if the spreadsheet takes too long to open, your book is probably too long.
I love the variety. Are you all reading right now? I know it's a lot going on. So if you're reading, what are you reading?
I just started Lily King's Writers and Lovers, but I'm also on deadline for my next book, and it's sometimes hard for me to read while I'm writing because I can get so enamored with what I'm reading that I feel like, why am I writing? Like what do I have to add? Or I tend to I'm very mimetic, and I'll mimic whoever I'm reading. So, but I just started that one and I'm loving it so far.
I finally felt like I could read again, maybe like a week and a half or 2 weeks ago. I was not reading when the pandemic first started, and I was reading a lot of news, and now I'm like trying to cut back on that. So actually I'm like maybe a fourth of the way through Inheritors. I got a galley of Asako's book, so I'm reading that, and it is so beautiful. Asako, I mean, I'm really loving it. And then I also got this DMZ Colony, which is by Don Michoi, which is a little bit easier for me to read because it is sort of like a hybrid text, like poetry, imagery, some like short prose sections, and that has been able to engage me a little bit more just because it comes in like bite-sized pieces, even though it's about it is about a heavier topic. But yeah, those are two books that I'm reading now, at least.
I also have had moments where I like really felt like I needed to read, and then moments where I was just like, oh my God, I can't. I just recently finished Baldwin's Notes of a Native Son, which was really interesting to read here. So I'm in France. I was stuck here because of the lockdown. I'm at an artist residency, and they've been really kind. I'm at the Camargo Foundation. They've gone on housing us, and they've been incredible. But so being in France and reading, Baldwin writing about America and then about his time living in Paris has been really, really interesting. And I also just finished We Have Always Been Here, Samna Habib's memoir of being queer and Muslim. And that was really great. And I'm about to start Khalid Khalifa's Death is Hard Work, which is translated from the Arabic. And I've heard such good things about it. So I know it's going to be a heavy read, but I'm really excited for it. So.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I think I've been researching for the next book, and so I've been reading a lot of nonfiction and kind of academic-y stuff, which actually I can sort of read, as long as it's not too heavy. But one writer that I've been sort of obsessed with is Svetlana Alexievich. She's like a Belarusian writer who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago, and she writes these incredibly rich, incredibly emotionally charged sort of literary oral history that's drawn from interviews and testimonies and things, but she takes poetic license to draw out these stories, of people living through a certain historical time. And just the breadth and depth she achieves is just so inspiring, and I'm reading the one about Chernobyl right now, which is kind of intense, but it's really, really, really great, satisfying.
I think, like everybody else, I'm having trouble keeping larger works in my head while also writing and sort of just living. But I find short stories to be very comforting now. My goal is I'm sort of like I'm training. Like I'm reading short stories, and now I'm going to start reading longer short stories. And I recently went to my shelf and literally just picked out all the novellas. Like it wasn't even based upon. It was my reading list is now based upon how thick the spine is rather than anything substantive. Which is not advice I would ever give anybody, but these are strange times. I will also say, I had the good fortune of teaching a creative writing workshop this semester, and we're still in it. And it's a sci-fi and fantasy workshop, and the students are sort of sequestered in their writing, and they're writing just such great stuff. I'm so, once you said just write out your fears and anxieties, they're a little quirky, they're a little weird, the stories and the students, but I really look forward to them week after week, and we get together and we discuss them. And I'm learning a lot about the way that, say, video games can influence the way the students write, and so it actually has been a great pleasure and a great joy.
Nice. So now's the time for the plugs. Do you guys have any additional projects in the works right now that you want to share?
Well, I'll just plug not just my own work, but one thing that is really cool about being a debut writer, and I bet a lot of you have seen this, is you meet all the other debut writers and you find out about their books. And it's so exciting to watch the books kind of like make their way step by step to the publication process. And then you discover all these great new writers. And I think from now on, even when I don't have a book coming out, I'll just follow debuts, and see what's out there. Especially right now, it's so sad with the pandemic that people can't go into bookstores and maybe necessarily meet debut writers or be introduced to their books. So that's kind of a cool way to discover new reading. I'm working on my second book right now, which is about a Playboy bunny in 1981. So it's kind of dark, though. It's running dark. So we'll see how it turns out. But it's due at the end of next week, so I'm kind of freaking out about getting it done. But it's I've written a draft. I'm revising it, but it's just a tremendous amount of work to write a book. I'm amazed that we do it. I can't believe I did it. So congratulations to everyone on this panel.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, I'm I mean, my book came out at the end of last month, so I'm still like wrapping my head around the whole having a debut out in the world and dealing with like all of the first book stuff alongside like first book during pandemic stuff. But I am also working on a short story collection. We'll see. I'm not working on it as much as probably I could be right now, but revising stories and writing a couple new ones. And those stories are right now. I'm saying that they're about Asian and Asian American characters who are dealing with some form of loss, and they tend to be a little bit more interior than exterior in terms of the drama, and I think that's true of my novel too. But yeah, I definitely agree with Christina that, you know, having a debut novel out has made me so much more aware of like all of the amazing books that are coming out each year. I was like, is 2020 like the best year in books? Just because I'm like paying attention now. So yeah, definitely going to like going forward also keep an eye out on all like new books coming out. So it's exciting, even though we're just like stuck on these screens.
It's been a weird time. I'm working on several different projects at the same time. And I think that's like helping me to, I don't know, jump from thing to thing when I get sort of overwhelmed. Two of them are novels. One is more, I guess the way that I'm putting this to myself is that I'm working on a project about visibility and invisibility and anger, and what we do with that anger, how we sort of like suppress it or sublimate it, and how we struggle to see each other along a lot of different lines. But that one's more based in the US. And then I'm also working on a project that's just about trans love. And that one's just making me happy. And then I'm also here working like at this residency. I came here to collaborate with my partner, who's a visual artist, on a project called the Atlas of Marvels, which is basically stems from the research I did for Map of Salt and Stars on like sort of ancient astronomy and traditions of the night sky around the Mediterranean, especially in the Levant and among indigenous Arab peoples and the indigenous peoples of North Africa, because a lot of those like star traditions are not talked about when we get taught like what, you know, how to look at the night sky. And so we're actually putting together this trans-Mediterranean multilingual atlas of the night sky based on the research I did over several years. And we're still continuing to do research. So, you know, we've been trapped in our, like, you know, as we're all sort of trapped in our apartments or our rooms or whatever, but we've been trying to like look out the window and try to look at the sky each night. And, you know, I think that's helping me at least to get through this, to like keep my mind on something that's bigger than me.
Sounds really cool.
Thanks.
I mean, I'm also sort of working on a second book, but it's really, really in early stages. And I mean, I can say that it's going to be a novel of some kind, but I'm not going to say anything else.
You know, I just want to echo that, you know, part of that entire process of being a debut is getting to know other writers. And there's such a strong community of people, and they're rooting for each other and they want you to succeed. You see each other at the same events over and over, and then you see the book go out into the world and it gets the praise that it deserves, and it just makes you so happy and so inspired for them. You know, the same is actually true for the independent bookstores that we should all give a shout out to. You know, you meet so many of them on the road at conventions, and they invite you into their stores and into their spaces, and you feel very, very privileged and very lucky. What am I working on right now? I'm actually working on mostly. I'm getting asked to do essays. You know, how do you navigate elections during the pandemic? How do you administer justice during the pandemic? Um, you know, I mean, you know, the challenge with writing an essay while you're going through something at the actual time presents its own challenges. There's not really an opportunity for reflection. And, you know, I think sometimes, at least for me, you know, the essays can veer to an extreme between, you know, anger or frustration or just sadness or, you know, I wouldn't say happiness too often, but so, writing and finding that voice and finding that tone is especially while you're going through something, I think is a challenge that I'm facing as I write nonfiction.
Very interesting. So we have just a few minutes left. We have some audience questions that were submitted. So some folks who knew you were going to pop in and email some questions in. One of them asked, what conversations in literary fiction do you wish people discussed more?
I think I'm not sure what that question means.
Yeah.
Okay, we can jump to the next one. If everyone's stumped, we can jump to the next
Well,
one.
I might offer, I came from a pretty traditional writing background. I have an MFA here in Wisconsin, and it's a great sort of artistic studio program. But I knew absolutely nothing about what to do once my book was over. I didn't know that process of getting an agent. I don't know what makes it. I didn't know what made a good agent. I didn't know how to sell the book. I didn't know how to talk about the book. And so I think for especially people who are trained in more traditional artist-based programs, trying to understand and navigate the actual commerce and business of the way that books works is something that I wish I knew a little bit. I wish I knew something about.
Great.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's sort of just like jogging my own thoughts about this, but I don't come from a like an arts background in terms of my training. I actually come from science, like hard science. I was a geneticist before I changed careers, and so like I went into publishing. I had always written, but I mean, publishing is obviously a really different thing. And I there's definitely a lot that I didn't know, and I wasn't clear on how to how information was sort of passed from person to person. And I guess one thing that I wish I had known is like how important other people are in like having a writing community, and having people that you trust to read your work, and to figure out to like how to be true to what it is that you actually want to write, especially if you are writing literary fiction, and not sort of be swayed by like, well, but maybe I should be writing something else, or I haven't seen this, and so maybe there's no space for it. Things like that took me maybe a little bit longer to kind of figure out how to even have those conversations with people. I didn't know if it was like if we could talk about those things, So finding people that I could talk about them with was really helpful.
Yeah, it's interesting with my book that when I was working on it, I was just telling this story. And then now that it's out in the world, I think people think of it as like the Cape Cod novel, or the Cape Cod is marketable. But I never, ever thought of it as like a beach read or something about Cape Cod. To me, it was literary fiction. I have a PhD in creative writing, and I was a professor, so it's kind of interesting to think of how work gets siloed. And it has to in a way. I understand why that happens. People need to know like basically what they're reading and what sort of category it falls in based on their interest. But it's just interesting to see how that's working.
I've had that same challenge. I mean, my blurbs include Lori Moore and John Grisham, which I think is probably the place in the entire universe you will see those two names together, and I'm grateful for both of their support. But the marketing team just was like, I don't know what to tell you, Steve. So
I'm actually about to go run to Mystery to Me to go buy your book right now. Hearing that.
So we've got a little bit of time for just one more. So the next question is, who would you like to thank for inspiring or supporting your writing career?
I think for me, I'd thank my husband. He's been really supportive the whole way through. He reads what I write, always has feedback. I don't think it's easy to be married to a writer or be in a partnership with a writer. I often wish I wasn't a writer. I find it hard to just be myself as a writer. So he's been really patient and supportive the whole way through.
Yeah, I agree. I'm in exactly the same boat. So yeah, and it requires so much patience, especially on his side. So Yeah, I'm really thankful as well for my partner.
Same, echoing, and my family and my partner's family. Everyone who has like supported the book along the way, and like even after it came out. And also I'm like really grateful to writers who I met in the MFA program. I went to Syracuse, and including professors, but even more so my peers. It having readers and having people who are supportive, like while you're writing and while you don't know what you're doing, that was really important for me. So
yeah, I mean, it really takes a village, to make a book, and I mean, everyone sort of does their part, and it's kind of amazing process.
Yeah, I think that like I would obviously thank, family, and especially my mom, who read to me a lot when I was a kid. And although I was discouraged from going into the arts as a kid, like also, when I was sort of a budding writer, like in elementary and middle school, and was writing stories, was supportive of that. But also I think that I have my chosen family are mostly writers. And I think it's like not necessarily an accident. Like I think we all kind of found each other. And a lot of us found each other through like either writing groups or conferences or whatever, workshops and things like this. And then we're like, oh, we really like each other. Like, you guys are really cool. And those people have become like family to me. So I'm just really grateful that, that we find our people as we go along, or at least hopefully we find our people.
And for me, my book is dedicated in part to, I have two sisters. I dedicated the book to one of them who has been a constant reader from the beginning when I started studying writing 10 years ago. That did, however, piss off the other sister who I did not dedicate the book to. And so, Jamie, if you're watching, I love you. I'm sorry. I did not know it would be a thing. You didn't want to read any of the pages, but you wanted the book dedicated to you. So, whatever. But, Jamie, I'm grateful for you. So.
All right. So that closes out on our hour together. I want to thank each and every one of you for hopping on and spilling your secrets and telling us about your projects you have coming up and talking about identity, and just appreciate you and thank you for your time. And that's it from us for now. And hopefully we'll see you on the internet sometime.
Thank you very much for hosting.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.